to open this latest edition of the Emerging Tech Speakers Series. And thank you to the Emerging Tech team for hosting this, sponsoring this. Our talk today is the rise of the smart farm machines, how proprietary lock-in threatens farmers and national security, and how open source can potentially save us all. It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce today's speaker, Rian Wanstreet, a PhD student at the University of Washington and my former colleague at Access Now, where she ran the RightsCon program and started Access's small grants program. Ryan's been focusing on studying the impact of new technologies on the agricultural sector. She's particularly concerned about the trend toward big data surveillance platforms in the industry and sees the growing interest in open source and platform cooperatives as an opportunity for farmers on a global scale to design their own data destinies. When I was talking to Ryan ahead of this talk, she was explaining to me something I hadn't thought about before, about how hacks on today's modern agricultural infrastructure and equipment could potentially lead to a literal salting of the earth as payloads of drones and other farming equipment get released by potentially by state actors and other malicious actors. And I think this raises real questions for society, for technology, for national security, and I'm happy to have her with us today to talk to us about some of these emerging issues and emerging threats. Please join me in welcoming her. We will take questions after Ryan's presentation on the emerging technologies Slack channel for those of you Mozillians on the audience. So that's #ET. Again, my pleasure and privilege to welcome Ryan. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today. I got to speak a couple days ago at the ORSA presentation, and one of the most difficult things on having to consolidate your research into 10 minutes is you have to decontextualize a lot of things, and I don't have to do that here. So I'm very excited to be able to flesh out some of these very important issues and to be a part of this community. So let's get started. Are you having trouble? That's the question a John Deere rep asked a man named Chuck Biebermeyer when they called him during a sleet storm. Chuck had been having problems getting through the earth. He didn't seem to be getting as much power through the engine. And it turned out that that's exactly what was happening. John Deere's sensors had recognized that there was some kind of problem with the air intake. And so for Chuck's safety, they had actually started to throttle the engine. Now I tell this story, like Chuck was obviously freaked out, but I tell this story because it's actually really emblematic of just how carefully machines on farms can be controlled and monitored now. Now that tractor is part of precision agriculture, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. What it is, how prevalent it is, what's driving its uptake, some of the problems that it presents, and how people are trying to deal with these problems. I should note that this is a really brief overview of a huge topic, and also it's really heavily US focused and largely deals with big ag, but this is a very global phenomenon and also deals with farms, small, medium size, etc. So, but if you're interested in talking about any of those issues, I am an academic and I'm happy to talk about any of that at great length and in great detail. So quite simply, precision agriculture is when farmers can take information from historical records, from satellites, from yield monitors, from sensors on their machines, and create what's called prescriptions. And these prescriptions can tell a farmer, or the farmer's machines themselves, things like where to plant, how deep a seed should go, how much water to put in the ground, where to put the fertilizer or the phosphorus. And it's being marketed as being more efficient, more cost-effective, more sustainable. And there's some evidence that this is true. So some farmers that have implemented these things have reported that they're using less water, for example. And of course, if you're using robots instead of laborers, ostensibly you have less labor costs, right? And I do have to admit that there are a lot of really cool robots in this space. So I wanted to show you just a couple. Up on the top, you have a John Deere driverless tractor, and that's actually the least cool thing on this slide. But I did want to put it up here to acknowledge that John Deere, at least a year or two ago, was the largest purveyor of automated vehicles on the planet. They were way ahead in this space, before Waymo, before Google. On the right, you have a right, yes, is the strawberry picker. And fruit and vegetable bots are becoming incredibly prevalent, incredibly quickly, and that's because of labor needs. On the bottom, you have the Prospero bots. Now they're cool, they work it together like bugs, like in an ant colony, and they tend to individual seeds and plants. Now, on the other side, you have the Hortobot. That's my personal favorite. They seek out individual weeds and can apply herbicide directly, but it's also equipped with a little something extra. It actually has lasers and a flamethrower for some really tenacious weeds, I guess. So behind the growth of this sector is a fact you will hear over and over again in almost every article you read. We're gonna have 9 billion people we have to feed by the year 2050. And it's true, we do have a growing population, and growing alongside of it is the precision agriculture market. I do have to say, I'm from Missouri, I have farmers in my family, and before I started this research, I had no idea how prevalent some of this had become on America's farmland and globally as well. In 2016, this market was worth about $3 billion. And a very lowball estimate of what it might be worth in 2021 is around $19 billion. Some people say that that's what just the robotics arm of this might be worth in 2021. It's been, since 2012, its investment has grown 20% every year. So that might be a reason that so many people are eager to get into this industry. So you have players that everybody's going to recognize, right? Like John Deere, Monsanto, and these companies have invested really early and very quickly in data analytics. But you also have new folks getting in, like IBM and Microsoft, and venture capitalists, many whom are involved in the tech industry, like Google Ventures. And this is a global phenomenon. Although North America has had, we've adopted it more quickly. We have about 50% of the market currently. The highest growth is anticipated to be in Asia, in Russia, in China, and Brazil has a very thriving market. So that's a very broad overview of this bustling market. Basically, we're in the midst of a fourth agricultural revolution. Big data and tech is going to save the world from famine. And by the way, a lot of people are going to make a lot of money. So what could be wrong with this, right? Well, obviously, there are some catches. And we're going to talk about a few of them. Like first, there's the problems with big data, and many of these are going to be very familiar to the folks that are listening to this talk. So some of the problems are like, how is it being monetized? Who owns it? Who has access to it? I'm very curious about how the algorithms are being written that are creating these prescriptions. Farmers are really concerned about this topic. They're in a relatively small pool, and so not only is their information potentially worth more, but they're also more easily identifiable. And they really want to know, how could this information potentially be used against them? So can the government access this data? Could their landlords? And if these algorithms, which have very keen predictive capabilities, say that they're not growing as much corn as they're supposed to, can their landlords kick them off their land? And speaking of predictive capabilities, could anyone use that information to play the market? And fundamentally, farmers really want to know, like, why should someone else make money off the data that they're generating? So in the cybersecurity realm, like anyone familiar with the Internet of Things at all knows about the problems with smart devices. Farmers' biggest fear is that they're going to walk outside one day and their tractors are going to be bricked. This is a really well-documented concern. I have a slightly larger concern, a couple of larger concerns. What would happen if somebody decided to go after an entire network? So say a malicious state actor decided that they wanted to hack John Deere's entire network or Monsanto's entire platform. Would it be possible to stop an entire part of America's harvest from coming in? Could you hack like a drone fleet to drop entire payloads of phosphorus or herbicides, like over riverbeds, for example? So this sounds kind of crazy, I know, but the FBI is very aware of the potential for attacks in this area. So in 2016, they sent out a bulletin to the farming community, and they were like, hey guys, we're really excited that you're buying into these technologies. We think it's gonna make your work more efficient, but like, by the way, you should know that you're now really vulnerable to ransomware. And like BT dubs, if you're involved in GMO crops, like hacktivists might just come after you. Now, their recommendation to farmers was that they become more active in their own cybersecurity, that they teach themselves about social engineering, that they start monitoring their outgoing data and block unknown IP addresses, to close unused ports, to utilize VPNs, and to start using two-factor authentication, and to make sure that everyone on their farms are doing the same thing. And that's really valuable suggestions, right? But it's a pretty heavy lift. I don't even know how to do half those things, and I'm pretty technically savvy. So potentially increasing the likelihood of cybersecurity attacks is the dependencies that farmers are starting to develop on proprietary software. So once a company decides that they no longer want to provide software updates for some of the tools that they're pushing out, or maybe the company goes bust, what happens? Are they just going to be perpetually vulnerable to outside attacks? Does it necessitate buying entirely new machines? You can also imagine the financial dependencies this would create, as very few farmers can afford to buy things like new tractors outright. These things can cost $500,000. Of course, I think that that's actually what that's exactly what some companies might want. So John Deere, for example, is actually a lender in this space. So not only are they selling these tractors, but they're the ones that are lending the money. So it creates this entire cycle of never-ending financial dependencies. So big data, cybersecurity threats, software and financial dependencies. These are just a few of the issues of concern. But before I move on to how people are responding to some of these threats, I want to take a brief detour and outline some of the less tangible concerns that are more directly tied to some of my research, for example. As you're talking to people in industry and in government, they'll say, like, of course cybersecurity is an issue and we're talking about it. Of course, we have to deal with data privacy and security, but like, we don't have time to stop. We have to adopt these technologies as quickly as possible. The gravity of the threat facing our planet is too important, because didn't you know we have 9 billion mouths we have to feed by 2050? The threat of famine has been wielded in the US to encourage the implementation of new technologies since the Industrial Revolution. It is a perpetual boogeyman, and it's one that I frankly find hard to take seriously when a full 73% of our farmland is used for the purposes of raising ethanol and cattle. So in the future, if you hear these kind of arguments made, like, I think it's really important for us to push back against some of this hyperbole. At best, it's a misrepresentation of facts or misguided techno-utopianism. And at worst, it's kind of a craven way to encourage farmers to buy into technology they may not need. These are market choices. So if I had more time, I'd also challenge some of the claims being made about efficiency, cost effectiveness, and sustainability. I think that you could legitimately cast some doubts about net profitability when you calculate the costs of many of these machines. We've already talked about how expensive they are. There's been little analysis done on the long-term and overall impact of the transition from manual to technical labor. So you may have less laborers on the farm picking these strawberries, but what does it mean when you have all of these new robots and costs and people having to deal with closing these ports and a new labor in that realm? And finally, I personally find it a little hard to believe that a corporation that sells herbicide will be willing to prescribe less and less of their own product over the long term. But I grew up in Missouri and my neighbor was Monsanto, so maybe that has just made me a little suspicious of certain companies. But let's switch to remedies, right? Because there are actually a lot of really cool things happening in this space. So in the area of data, a few years ago, because this was already starting to become kind of questions that farmers were asking, the American Farm Bureau created a set of non-binding data principles. And some corporations signed very quickly, and some even became certified, saying that they were following all of the principles. Now, the problem is that these principles heavily benefit corporations. So exploitative language can easily be enshrined in the end user license agreements that are passed on to farmers. So for example, providers can still easily sell data that they collect from their users in third-party contractors in turnkey to agree end user license agreements. So these farmers are agreeing to contracts without ever even seeing them. They just turn a key in their tractors and they've said yes. So this is part of the reason I think that you're seeing nonprofit data groups that are trying to fill a space. One of the first ones that came up was the Open Ag Data Alliance, and their goal was to combat the growing restrictions presented by the walled gardens of proprietary systems. Now, this group is still present, and people are still working on it, although you wouldn't be able to tell if you went to their website or to their social media. I think there was a couple problems it ran into, but a lot of it had to do with trust. So the Climate Corporation, which was one of the first signers and originators of the alliance, was bought by Monsanto, who also joined that alliance. And to say that Monsanto has somewhat of a reputation amongst farmers might be a little bit of an understatement. And that's typical in this field. You see new entities that gain a reputation and farmers get excited about it and join it. And then all of a sudden those things are bought by corporations that maybe farmers don't really want a relationship with. And so that's why I think you've also had secondary groups that have started to form, like the Agricultural Data Coalition, which is an NGO that wants to be a neutral, independent, farmer-centric data repository. Now, their tagline is that their farm data is farmer-controlled, which I have a hard time believing because their board is largely made up of lawyers, land use university academics, and agribusiness professionals. So I worry with capture a little bit there. The last one that I wanted to mention is something, it's actually a platform cooperative. I'm kind of excited about it. It is actually 100% farmer-led and farmer-owned, or at least almost 100% of their board is farmers. They not only want to be a neutral repository, but they want to create an analytical platform, and so they partnered with IBM. But both the ADC, the Ag Coalition, and the Growers Information Cooperative are relatively new, so we really have to see where they go. You also have commercial enterprises that are setting themselves up as like farmer-centric, farmer-friendly, data-forward alternatives to some of the proprietary systems. So one in particular has gained a lot of buzz in the community. It's called FarmRoble. It's based on open source software, and they do analytics, but their real innovation is that they've figured out a way to allow farmers to sell back the data that they're generating to other analytical companies. And that's something that farmers are really excited about because they want control of the data that they're generating. So I should mention that there's also been some pressure in Congress to classify ag data similarly to how medical data is classified. And there's actually been hearings on this, but everyone agrees that such a remedy is quite a ways off. And there is actually some working groups that's dealing or like talking about some of the larger cybersecurity issues as well. So I think it's important to talk about the right to repair fight as well, which might seem like a tangential issue, but farmers have become kind of surprisingly almost the face of this fight in some ways. And if you're not familiar with right to repair, it's basically a movement that's trying to ensure that folks have the right to modify or fix or do what they want with their technical or mechanical equipment. Now, farmers have gotten involved because they're really not happy with being told that they don't have the right to fix their machines, to modify their tractors. And I think once the realization set in for them, when they bought these new like high-tech machines, that they would need to talk to a dealer to even diagnose a problem, dealers who could be hundreds of miles away, many began to look for alternative ways to get around those issues. Some of them began to hack their own tractors. Some even began to go to shady forums and download like Ukrainian software as workarounds. Now, I am tempted to, I think it's tempting to celebrate these actions, right? And I'm certainly very grateful for farmers' visibility in the right to repair fight. I am a huge supporter of right to repair, but I have a couple of caveats with this. While farmers might want to preserve their right to repair, there's been some disconnect with them joining the larger movement. And there's a good reason for this. So in Nebraska, for example, one of the first things that happened when the first bill was proposed, right to repair bill was proposed, was Apple and AT&T lobbyists flooded the State House. And obviously that spooked the farmers. And so that's why you see in a couple states, and I think there's like 18 or 19 states that are considering these bills at this point, a couple states are only considering right to repair for agricultural equipment. Now, the second thing I wanted to mention is that Ukrainian software that they're downloading, right? That's a little sketchy. Like, what else is on that software? Like, what else could be on that software? Like, is it possible to have malware that could be activated at a later date? I'm actually working with a research scientist in the Security and Privacy Lab at UW, and if we can marshal some resources, this is something we'd really like to investigate. So I think right to repair is, in some ways, a battle about software dependencies. And certainly in the ag sector, it is indicative of a growing insurgency against proprietary systems. And you're certainly seeing momentum in the open source space at large in the ag sector that are trying to encounter entrenched corporate interests. Although perhaps unsurprisingly, they're running into problems with scale and some with industry capture. So I wanted to mention like both what's happening in the open source tools sector and then the software. Some of you might be familiar with the open source ecology movement or civilization in a box. They've begun prototyping tractors, combines, etc. Some of them that only have 100 parts. There's FarmHack. That's a community of collaborators that have been working to develop a open source library of farming tools and knowledge, and they've been working together since 2011. And then even on the commercial side, you have a couple folks that are building like open source tractors. One at least called the Ogun that costs less than $13,000. The problem with all of these tools is that they're mostly meant for smaller farms. There's not many alternatives for the larger enterprises that mostly dominate the US system. And that might mean that some of the greatest innovations you see in this area are going to be in nations that don't have mega farms. And actually, that's largely turning out to be true. There's some really cool things happening in places like Indonesia, for example. But luckily, there are some great innovations in the software space. So for example, you have FarmOS, which is a web-based app for farm management. It does all the analytics, and that's based on Drupal. You also have the University of California in Santa Barbara is developing an open source analytical program called Smart Farm. And I'm really interested to see where this goes because it has a distributed architecture and its analytics is all done on the farm. So they're working to create a private black boxed cloud. And I think that that's something that I haven't seen really talked about anywhere else. Now there's a handful of other ones, but I just wanted to mention a couple. So this all leads me to my last point, and this has gone very quickly. I mentioned earlier that I had no idea of all of these technologies being adopted in this space. And I think that that's pretty common based upon my conversations with folks in the tech policy sector. It's easy to forget that some of the tools and the policies that we work on, largely on the coast and in urban spaces, have such real impacts in sectors that maybe we don't see and think about a lot. But the same issues that we talk about, like in this building, on Twitter, in all of our conferences, surveillance platforms, surveillance capitalism, consolidation of power by corporations, the problems with the IoT and how it poses threats to security and privacy. These things are quickly becoming as prevalent on our farms as they are already on our phones. And there's a deep desire amongst many in the ag community to be a part of this technological and data ecosystem. They see the potential benefits, but they want to do it in a way that allows them to maintain their agency and independence. And I think that there's still time for this to happen. This is an industry that hasn't quite solidified to a point where it's being dominated by one or two corporations, and policies are still very much in development. And there are people on the ground, as you've seen, that are already working to develop open and secure alternatives that can not only just keep the internet healthy, but might actually help keep our planet healthy. And I suspect that that's something that people in this organization are uniquely interested in doing. But I think we should start working on this as soon as possible, because that tipping point is right around the corner, and we might not have such opportunities tomorrow. Thank you.
Don't go anywhere yet.
Okay.
So thanks, Ryan. That was fascinating. And already we've had one person say that they're going to talk to their farmer friends and family about disabling some of that Ukrainian software. So again, we're going to be taking questions in the hashtag ET Slack channel. For those of you who are in a Commons, there are those nifty boxes you can throw with mics. Chris, do you have a question, Chris?
I have a question.
Great. Maybe you can model the behavior we're looking for.
I will. I'll use the...
And if you could introduce yourself, that would be great.
Thank you, Yokai, and thank you, Ryan. It's very interesting. I'm Chris Riley. I'm here in San Francisco for those watching on video. I run the policy team. There's a lot in here, and it's really interesting to see how the wonky issues that I and my team work on, like copyright policy and competition policy and cybersecurity and so forth, have these kind of very proximate real-world impacts. You're trying to tell a positive story, but I'm still seeing evolution of technology like AI feeling like it's going to further unlevel the playing field between large agriculture corporations and small farmers. How can we hope to really get out ahead of that, and at a time when particularly policy and law around AI are still very, very unformed, and the norms around this are very unformed? Is there a way to bring in the agriculture conversation into the AI conversation to try to help? Because it's not just in agriculture. Obviously, we want to shape a future of AI that helps small businesses across the board, not just large businesses, get into that. And also, I mean, I'm here in San Francisco where we just signed up for a co-op delivering us locally grown small producer of fruits and vegetables. Like there's a movement there that doesn't connect with the tech policy. And I think what you're doing is really interesting that it sits in there. And like, what can we do on the policy wonk side to help bridge that divide a little bit more and try to level that playing field more? I didn't really give you a whole lot. That was a little broad and over the place.
Yeah, so I'll try to answer as best I think I can. I think there's a couple opportunities. Like one, just because this, even though like yes, these like people are already talking about AI policies and they're talking, but the industry in agriculture is still very much growing. Like it's still very much nascent. And so yes, you have these entrenched corporations that are already very much dominating in other ways. But there's still opportunities to kind of get involved now because this new area hasn't quite yet been developed. So that's why I think that there's like it's kind of a unique opportunity where that tipping point hasn't happened yet. I also think that right now a lot of the support for research, the support for research, first of all, is coming from corporations like John Deere and Monsanto. And so if there's support that starts coming from other elements that maybe have different perspectives, that might help like combat some of that a little bit and also bring different perspectives that might open up some of the opportunities and also spread concepts of possibilities, that there are alternatives to these models, etc. I also, though, think that there's maybe less of a recognition that like people were already starting to doubt, they were already starting to question their relationships with a lot of these corporations even before these data issues were coming up. So apparently one of the biggest surprises to corporations like, I keep saying Monsanto and Deere, but obviously they're not the only ones in the field. I don't want to only pick on them. Is that when they first started to ask their customers to sign on to these agreements, is that farmers were like, we don't want to do this. Like, we don't trust you. And that really took these corporations back. They thought that they just had the implicit consent and trust and absolute, like, you know what, we're buddies, guys. What's this deal? So I think there's already like an understanding and a growing like fear of being caught in these relationships that they don't want to be. But there's a lack of understanding about other options, and there's lack of other viable options. And so the more that we can raise awareness of opportunities and and make those opportunities viable, I think more people will want to join and be a part of it than you think.
That's cool. I also want to now organize. Is this live? Okay, good. I also now want to organize a small independent farmers fly-in day to talk to Congress if there's ever AI legislation that's being considered, to help make sure that it works for everybody. That could be so much fun. So that would work well.
There's actually, I think very soon, there's a consumer hearing on the Internet of Things. And I think that it would be great to get farmers to participate in that discussion, if that's possible. And there's definitely, like, there's a robust, in some of the areas that have had the heaviest adoption of some of these systems, you also are starting to see the heaviest pushback against the systems. The demand for some of these larger tractors and larger smart devices is actually decreasing as people are looking to go back to some of the older tractors. My partial fear, though, is that you'll start to see some of these machines being pushed on countries. Like, I know that there's a lot of agricultural secretaries coming in from different places around the world who see this as a way to like jumpstart their own agricultural economy. And I kind of fear they're going to get trapped into systems without really understanding the repercussions as well.
So we have a couple of questions that have come in online, but Mark, we have a note that Air Mozilla dropped. So AVOps, if you're watching or not, is taking a look at that. So I want to pick up on something you just said. One of our questions sort of asked about, you were talking about how Deere and other folks were surprised that folks didn't sort of intuitively trust them. Mm-hmm. One of our questions asks, how does trust work differently in open farming platform cooperatives versus these more enterprise-led initiatives? And what are sort of the mechanisms and tools and efforts that are done to build trust differently in those two sort of broad categories of systems and organizations?
I don't know if I can fully answer that fully, because I think that it's a little difficult because you have corporations that are billing themselves as new and trustworthy, and all of a sudden people turn around and they're now customers of Monsanto again. But that's why I'm very keen to see what happens with like the platform cooperatives, for example, or the NGOs, for example, as opposed to the more corporate side. But of course, those are going to run into like scale issues and. So to a certain extent, those more NGO entities are a little too new for me to really identify, and I also haven't had much of an opportunity to look into what their bylaws look like to actually see how they consider themselves, like what their cooperative structure really looks like. Like there are a couple cooperatives that are out there that already exist that I don't think should rightly be able to call themselves cooperatives, frankly, but. I mean, I do think that they're all, even with there are certain companies even that are trying to put like farmer forward concepts even within their mission statements, and I think that is also a way forward.
Cool. We have another question sort of going back to the IoT certification sort of marks that we were just talking about. The questioner asked The efforts to establish IoT certification marks for targeted consumer products, do these efforts apply to the agricultural sector? Have you seen already some of these sort of certification schemes, licensing schemes, consumer labeling that we've sort of seen discussed in the IoT, consumer space also applied to ag tech?
I mean, I think that they're starting to bleed over, but I'm not sure to the degree that they're like it's required or necessary. But that's a great question, and I should learn more about it.
My father, who's an academic, would say that's a great homework question.
It is a great homework question, yes.
Another question, have you seen any connections between the sort of competition policy conversation that we've seen around some of the largest tech companies and the lack of competition in the big ag tech space? And do you think there are benefits or concerns that you'd have in trying to sort of merge some of those conversations?
Can you restate the question? I'm sorry.
So we've obviously had a lot of public discourse around competition threats to the increasing consolidation of power amongst Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, so forth. We know that there's sort of a lack of competition in big ag tech as well. Some of these open source farmer collective operations notwithstanding. Have you seen these conversations sort of being merged anywhere, and do you think they should be, or do you think there are benefits or risks or concerns around that?
Well, I think in the same way that mergers and acquisitions are kind of like the hallmark of the tech space, that is very much the hallmark of the agricultural space. And it's certainly, I mean, you just saw Bayer and Monsanto, whether that's a merger or an acquisition, I still am a little confused by that. But that absolutely typifies what's happening in the ag space. And you have industry leaders that are trying to gobble up every single startup that has any interesting idea they possibly can. We chatted a little bit about this actually previously. I personally am concerned about it because I feel like it ends up trapping farmers in relationships that they were implicitly trying to get out of. Like they didn't want to have, like I've seen articles and interviews with farmers who are like, I chose this because I didn't want to be with company X and now I'm with company X again, like fantastic. But there are also benefits, like partnerships work because you need these different softwares and platforms to work together. But I do think that the more you have consolidation, the more you're going to have these software and financial dependencies that people will not be able to get out of. And at what point do you have to acknowledge that we don't have like ownership or like even a capitalist system? It's more like feudalism.
So, another question I asked, so there's sort of a fair bit of financial incentive to keep things closed here, if you're a John Deere of the world.
Oh, yeah.
How do we promote open practices and open policies against that sort of budget and financial incentives of those very large players?
Yeah. I mean, the way that the people are doing it, that are trying to do it, is to bill themselves as like, we are not here to own your data. We're not going to try to take advantage of your data or sell your data. We're putting that in your hands. So they're building themselves specifically as like the anti-proprietary walled garden systems. And that comes with some drawbacks, right? Because part of the benefits of Deere and Monsanto's platforms is that they are taking in information from so many different places, and their analytical systems are incredibly robust because of it. So the more that you can get people to sign on to those different types of open source platforms, the better those analytics will become. And you do have a lot of open sourced like data sets from the USDA, for example, that helps with that. But farmers are also very aware, even the ones that are joining in those open sourced, like the newer alternatives, that if enough farmers don't go over that way, they're gonna have to go back to their proprietary models because it'll be better in their long-term interest.
So another question, what are the legislative solutions that you'd like to see to respond to the threats you've talked about?
Yeah, so first of all, I think like the right to repair initiatives are pretty important, but they are kind of a parallel issue, right? I think working on like Internet of Things, that some of the initiatives that are already being discussed, like to make Internet of Things more consumer friendly and also just like consumer safe is important. I'm a little bit wary of over-regulating certain areas because I think that actually might entrench interests further. But I do want to encourage policies to be developed that will actually help platforms grow, like nonprofit platforms grow, et cetera. And part of that might be taking away the financial incentives that like things in the Farm Bill give to proprietary systems. So for example, you have like precision agriculture is being heavily pushed forward by the USDA. And they will give tax bonuses or, tax incentives to farmers that adopt what's called variable rate technologies. And they'll give like an extra 20 cents, I'm making these up, but this is an example, 20 cents per acre to those that have Guide Star technologies from John Deere. That's 7 cents more than anyone that uses not open source technology. Why is that different? You're like, why are they preferencing that proprietary software? And like, they're probably going to say it's because of subscription novels, but really they're like subsidizing a proprietary network. So I think eliminating some of those differences, or even starting to preference some of the open source systems would be a first start that I would like to see.
Do we have questions in some of the other commons? One sec. Okay, Jess? Chris, you want to toss them?
Hi. Oh my gosh. I'm Jessica, and my question is a little bit off the policy topic. I come from an impact investment social entrepreneurial background, and I know quite a few people who are interested in agriculture in general as a topic. I don't know to what extent people are aware of this. It might be they're all over it. Might be that it's far afield, but I guess I have two parts of this. One is, do you talk in those circles very often? And the second is, is there an annotated list or bibliography somewhere of current investment opportunities? Is there an ecosystem that's already being built around some of the support for some of these new technologies? I mean, other than obviously open sourced Internet of Things platforms, but some of the applications thereof. Is that something that's online and available that I could maybe send out?
I mean, I've certainly started it is not a formalized list, let's put it that way, but I'm happy to start to see if I can start to put something together. Yeah.
Could be a cool open source project.
It could be a cool open source project. I think it would take some time to develop one that is fairly robust, because a lot of them are quite small. And like, you have the difference between the hardware and the software, right? And a lot of them they're just in development stages, or they're very nascent, and they're only being localized to different places. And I think there's also a question of the stuff that's being developed in the US versus the stuff that's being developed outside of the US, which there's a lot of robust projects outside of the US that deserve a lot of credit, which I didn't have time to get into here. But like, as you saw, like, investment in this sector is insane. So I don't see any reason why people wouldn't be interested in investing in this area of it too.
I want to pick up on that little moderator's prerogative here.
Sure.
So, you sort of said that we know in the U.S. there are certain entrenched interests, yes. Certain incentive structures, certain legislation that empowers those actors. Is there anywhere else in the world that is doing this well? That is sort of a good example that we can point to, some best practice that we can look at, where you're not seeing some of these confluence of factors?
That's a great question. I mean, it's hard to... I'm going to say no, because precision agriculture is still so new, right? That some people might be doing it more deliberately. I mean, I'm going to bring up China right now, and this is a weird thing. China is actually incredibly heavily invested in everyone's agriculture. They're like partial owner of everybody's biochemical companies. Like they're in it to win it everywhere, but they don't allow investment anywhere else. Like no one from any other country is allowed to invest in their agriculture. They don't allow GMO crops to be grown, really. Like they barely allow any GMO crops to be sold in their country. But they have absolutely like prioritized the fast forwarding of kind of like efficiently, of trying to update their agricultural systems. I don't know yet quite, nobody knows what that looks like yet, but they're working very hard to develop it in a sustainable way. And you have to give them credit, is that they're prioritizing sustainability in a way that I don't think many people are. So the fact that they're kind of moving away from like overdependence on herbicides and phosphorus and stuff is really interesting. So I'm very curious to see where they go. I know it's really it's a weird thing to bring them up, but I don't know. Like one of the countries I'm actually worried about is Brazil, because they've pretty much just like adopted wholesale the model that we're pushing forward here.
In a bad way, you're saying?
Yes. Yeah.
Cool. We have another question. You mentioned scale and consolidation on farms as one of the variables here. Could you expand on that more? In my past life, when I was very close to this stuff, the incentives towards large scale and monocultural are other long-term issues that intersect with precision agricultural systems, but not the sort of direct cause here.
Yeah, so that's still the case. Like the push towards monoculture and the push towards like consolidation of farms is still absolutely 100% the case in the US, and it's also being pushed forward through precision agriculture. Like that's one of the reasons that farmers are so afraid of their landlords having access to this data, for example, because they're afraid that if the landlords can see that they're not growing as much as they should, they'll just kick them off their land and their neighbors, or if their neighbors can have access to that data, that they'll make a bid for that land and then adopt take over that land. I think the question is like, how do these two issues relate, like scale? I think it's hard to develop, especially with hardware, the type of devices you would need to tackle some of the issues on these large scale farms. I mean, you do have the development of some really cool like robots and stuff like that, as I illustrated, and they might be able to tackle some of the problems, but they're not going to be able to deal with like the large amounts of like combines and large tractors that like Deere and Holland and Case have really kind of solidified the market on. So I don't know how to combat that.
You talked earlier about hyperbole in this space. You got a lot of snaps and kudos for that online on the Slack channel. What are the biggest myths that you'd like to see die in this space? Let's limit to like 3.
Okay. I mean, the first one is about the famine thing. And I'm not trying to deny that we have a growing population, but like the degree to which I have seen evidence of the US government and big corporations pushing this concept of like, oh, like everybody's gonna die if we don't adopt these technologies. You have to do it now. Like there's posters that I've uncovered, like the USDA has some incredible taglines. It's a weird thing because, like, of course, you want to make sure everybody gets fed, but like, come on, like, we're subsidizing an ethanol, so that is the big one. I'd like to really, I'd like to see that one die. In other areas,
would you say you have binders full of big ag propaganda?
I do. Like, I have quite a bit of big ag propaganda, and there's a lot of, I think a lot of. It's not just big ag, it's also USDA. And I'm sure a lot of it's very well meaning, I think, but there's definitely a marriage between government and big corporation in a lot of this area. So the second thing that I would like to see die is that something has to be like, ooh, I don't even know if this fits, but I'm really sick of the efficiency argument. That something has to be super efficient in order to be like worthwhile. And especially when it comes to like the implementation of like switching over to big data. Like they match those two things consistently. Like, oh, the reason we should like trust big data is because it's going to make everything more efficient. Well, that like it dismisses like half of the problems of using big data in analysis. And I think that that's a problem you see with almost every industry that's talking about big data uses. But the agricultural system in general has always had a problem with like pushing forward with efficiency. So I guess that's my second one. Can I think about the third one for a minute?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's, do we have any other questions either online or in any of the comments? Going once, going twice. All right, what's your third myth that you want to see die?
This is gonna, okay, so the majority of farms in America are still owned by families, like, which I know is kind of strange.
That's the myth or that's the fact?
That's the myth. Or no, that's the fact. So I'd like, sorry, like that is a true statement. And I think that there's like almost an idea that like the family farm has died. Now the problem is like most family farms in America are like freaking huge. Like, so like they're like mogul farms at this point, you know, but like, so some of the farmers are the ones that are the most concerned about the estate tax in America. Like they're very, very like in that battle. And so you hear this myth, or you hear this statement that, oh, family farms have died, and small farms have died. Like smaller family farms, a lot of them have been absorbed and died, and like farmers are constantly on the nice edge of like profit margins in this industry is very small. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but to say that like the family farm is dead is to ignore a very big truth, and it also gives, I think, a lot of power to certain parties when they can respond like, look at all the stats I have that prove that this isn't true. So.
Awesome, thank you. So thanks, Ryan, for this insightful and informative talk. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for coming here. And thanks to our colleagues at Emerging Tech for sponsoring this talk. And thanks to all of you watching in the comments and online. This talk has been recorded and will be available to watch later on Airmo and on YouTube, I think. And thank you all for coming and for your attention. Have a great day.
Thank you.